Don't save me, Daniel. Those four words came from my father's mouth under the fluorescent lights of an emergency room at St. Vincent Medical Center, the hospital where I had spent 30 years building my career as a cardiac surgeon. His heart was failing. I knew exactly what needed to happen next. I could help him. The surgical team could give him a good chance. He wouldn't let me. Instead, he pressed a brown envelope into my hands and made me promise not to open it until he was gone. I broke that promise within the hour. What I found inside didn't just explain why my father was willing to let his heart fail that night. It exposed a 25-year-old secret that had already reached into my career, my marriage, and my home. And before the sun came up, I would understand that the man I trusted most at the hospital had once threatened to destroy my future before it had even begun. I am a cardiac surgeon. For 30 years, I have believed that fear becomes manageable the moment you can name it. A blocked artery has a name. A failing valve has a name. You study it, you make a plan, and you act before the window closes. What I never learned to name was the quiet distance that had lived between my father and me for most of my adult life. And I had no idea that distance was about to collapse in a single night. My father, Frank Reed, spent 40 years repairing machinery in factories around Chicago. His hands were permanently rough, the skin across his knuckles, thick with old scars. He could diagnose a dying engine by sound alone, but he could never tell me the last time he'd said, "I'm proud of you." When I was a boy, I wanted a father who put a hand on my shoulder and told me I was doing well. Instead, Dad showed up with a repaired bicycle, left cash on the kitchen counter without a word, or sat outside my bedroom door when I was sick because he claimed he was checking the furnace. He loved through labor. I understood that only much later, and by the time I did, we had already spent years talking past each other. My mother understood him better than I ever did. She died when I was 24 while I was in medical school, exhausted and terrified that one failed exam could destroy the future I had spent years chasing. Dad called me late one night. "Your mother is gone." I remember staring at the anatomy textbook open in front of me. "I'm coming home," I told him. There was a pause on the line. "You have an exam tomorrow," he said. "Dad, Mom just died." "I know. She'd want you to take the exam." I hated him for saying it. I took the exam anyway, and for years I told myself that was what my mother would have wanted. But underneath that explanation was another truth I never said out loud. I was afraid to go home and see her room empty. After that, something hardened between us. I finished medical school, completed residency, became a surgeon, married Emily, and we had two children, Claire and Michael. My career grew. Dad stayed in the same modest house where I'd grown up, and I called him less than I should have, visited less than he deserved. Whenever I did go, we found something to argue about. His diet, his blood pressure, his stubborn refusal to let anyone help him. One afternoon, I opened his refrigerator and found mustard eggs and leftovers old enough to vote. "You can't keep living like this," I said. He didn't look up from the newspaper. "I've been living like this for years." "You're 78. I was aware of that this morning. You need someone checking on you." "I have neighbors." "Neighbors aren't family." He finally lowered the paper. "You have a strange way of showing that." I closed the refrigerator harder than I meant to. "You make everything difficult." He folded the newspaper slowly, the way he always did when he wanted the last word to land. "You know what your problem is, Daniel? You think because you can fix a heart, you understand one." I left before I said something I couldn't take back. For 11 days, I didn't call him. Then at 2:17 in the morning, my phone rang. It was one of the emergency physicians at St. Vincent. "Dr. Reed, it's your father." I drove through a dark, wet city with my hands locked around the wheel streetlights smearing across the windshield in broken yellow lines. I had entered St. Vincent 1,000 times with a surgeon's confidence. That night I walked in as a terrified son. His tests were worse than I feared. A major coronary artery was critically blocked. His heart rhythm was becoming unstable on the monitor beside his bed. Without treatment, he could die within hours. With urgent intervention, his chances were good. Not perfect, but good. I stood over him and forced myself to speak the way I speak to every patient. "Dad, we can fix this." His eyes opened. "No. Your artery is severely blocked." "I know. Your heart is failing." "I know." "Then let us treat you." He looked at me for a long, terrible moment. "No." My voice sharpened without my permission. "Do you want to die?" He didn't flinch. "Yes." The words seemed to pull the air out of the room. I stared at the man who had spent his whole life fixing broken things, including me, the man who once drove through a blizzard at midnight because I had a fever, and I could not understand how he had arrived at that single terrible word. "You don't mean that," I said. "I do." "You're scared." "No." "Then what is this?" His expression shifted, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes more frightening than the diagnosis on the monitor. Regret. He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a brown envelope worn soft at the corners, as if he'd carried it in his coat pocket for years, waiting for a night exactly like this one. "What is that?" I asked. "Something I should have given you a long time ago," he said. My name was written across the front in his unmistakable handwriting. Not son. Not Danny. Daniel. The name he only used when something mattered. "What's inside?" He turned his face toward the window instead of answering. "Promise me you won't open it until I'm gone." I promised. It was the kind of promise you make to a dying man without meaning to keep it, and some part of me already knew that. My father closed his eyes, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, he looked almost at peace, as if handing me that envelope had cost him something he'd been carrying far too long. I had no idea yet that the man lying in that bed had spent 25 years protecting me from a secret that was about to reach into my own house. They wheeled my father toward a recovery bay to stabilize him before surgery, and a nurse gently reminded me that I couldn't do anything more standing in that room. I carried the envelope to my office, instead my hands unsteady, in a way 30 years of surgery had never made them. That may sound strange coming from a man who has made incisions while alarms were sounding, who has made irreversible decisions in seconds, while an entire team waited on his voice. But this wasn't a medical problem. There was no scan to interpret, no textbook to consult. It was my father. And somehow I was more afraid of what he had written than I was of losing him. I closed my office door. Outside, the glass wall nurses moved through the corridor the way they always did, the soft electronic beeping of monitors, the distant overhead announcements, the squeak of rubber soles on polished floors. Everything sounded normal. Nothing about my life was. I looked at my promise, the one I just made at his bedside, and I broke it within the hour. I told myself later that I broke it because I needed to understand what I was fighting for if he went into surgery that night. The truth is simpler than that. I broke it because I couldn't stand not knowing. Inside the envelope was a single folded letter and a small flash drive. I unfolded the letter and recognized my father's handwriting, immediately blunt and economical, a mechanic's handwriting. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then either I lost the argument about surgery or you stopped being stubborn long enough to listen. Knowing you, it's probably the first one." I almost smiled. Even facing what might have been his last night, he couldn't resist a jab at me. Then I read the next line and the smile disappeared. "There are things about your medical career I never told you. 25 years ago, I discovered something at the hospital where I was working on contract repairing equipment. A cardiac device was being released for use, even though internal testing had shown a serious defect. I tried to stop it. I went through the proper channels. Nobody listened. A man named Robert Miller died because of that device, Daniel. He was 51. He had a wife and 2 daughters younger than you were at the time." My chest tightened. I kept reading. I refused to stay quiet. I collected records. I asked questions I wasn't supposed to ask. And that's when people with more money and power than I had decided the truth was inconvenient. They found out I had a son who was already in medical school and had built his entire future around becoming a doctor. They knew how hard you had worked and how much depended on staying on that path. They made it clear that if I kept pushing, they could make sure your future became much harder than it already was. The next line was underlined so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "They threatened your future to protect their own. I had a choice between the truth and you. I chose you. I have never once regretted that choice, but I have spent 25 years wondering if you would forgive me for the way I made it." At the bottom of the page was a single name written smaller than the rest, as if my father had hesitated even to put it on paper. "Dr. Marcus Vale." I sat very still. I knew that name better than almost any other name at St. Vincent. Marcus Vale was one of the most respected administrators in the entire hospital system, a man with a polished silver head of hair, tailored suits, and the particular gift of making you feel important while quietly reminding you who controlled the room. He had recruited me 12 years earlier. He had championed my promotion to chief of cardiac surgery. He had introduced me to donors who funded half the equipment in our operating rooms. He had written the recommendation letter that helped me win a national award 3 years ago. Once, years back, when my father made an offhand comment about not trusting him, I had actually defended Marcus. "You don't know him, Dad," I'd said, irritated. Now I stared at that name on the page, written in my father's hand, dated to a time before Marcus had ever recruited me, before I had ever set foot inside St. Vincent in a white coat. The flash drive sat in my palm, small and unremarkable, and I felt a strange reluctance to plug it into my computer, as if doing so would make whatever was on it permanently, irreversibly real. I did it anyway. It contained a single audio file, no title, just a date stamped 25 years old. I put in my earbuds and pressed play. The recording was rough, the kind of quality you'd get from a small device hidden in a shirt pocket, but the voices were unmistakable. One was younger, unmistakably my father's, tighter and angrier than I had ever heard him. The other voice was smooth, controlled, patient, in the way powerful men are patient when they already know they'll win. "You're not thinking about this clearly, Frank," the second voice said. "You have a son who is already in medical school and trying to build a future. Do you understand what a formal complaint would do to that? Medical schools ask questions. Hospitals talk to one another. Board members remember names. I would hate for your son's career to become complicated." I recognized that voice instantly. 12 years of meetings, 12 years of hospital galas, 12 years of a mentor's hand on my shoulder had burned it into my memory. It was Marcus Vale, 25 years younger, but unmistakably him. I sat in my office for a long time after the recording ended, the flash drive still in my hand, my father down the hall being prepared for a procedure he didn't want, and the man who had shaped the last 12 years of my career, revealed as the person who had once threatened to destroy my future before it began. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text message from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no greeting, just one line. "You shouldn't have opened that envelope." Beneath it was a photograph. My house taken at night from across the street. The stone walkway, the porch light Emily always left on, the maple tree by the driveway. I enlarged the image with shaking fingers and found a faint reflection in our front window glass. A dark, blurred shape standing exactly where I was standing right now, close enough to see straight into the room where my children slept. I stared at that photograph until the hospital corridor around me seemed to tilt on its axis. Whoever had sent it knew within the hour that I had opened an envelope I'd sworn to leave sealed. That meant one of two things, and both of them terrified me. Either my father had told someone he shouldn't have trusted, or someone had been watching this hospital, watching me, waiting for exactly this moment. I called Emily before I let myself think any further. She answered on the second ring, her voice already tight with the particular alertness of a mother who has learned to hear fear in the smallest change of tone. "Daniel, what's wrong? Where are you right now?" "Home. Why?" "Lock the doors, all of them." A pause longer than I wanted. "Daniel, you're scaring me." "Please, Emily, just do it." I heard the deadbolt turn through the phone, then her footsteps moving quickly across our kitchen floor. "It's locked. Checking the back now." Another pause. "Locked. Go get the kids. They're asleep. Wake them. Bring them into your room with you." "Daniel, what is going on?" I looked down the empty hallway toward the operating suite where my father had disappeared behind two heavy doors. "Someone sent me a picture of our house, taken tonight, from outside." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then quietly she asked, "Are you sure?" "I'm looking at it right now." I told her everything, standing there in that fluorescent hallway with the smell of antiseptic thick in the air, my voice dropping lower with every sentence. The envelope. The recording. Robert Miller. The name Marcus Vale, 25 years younger, threatening my father's future and mine before I even understood what a medical career would cost. When I finished, Emily was quiet for a long moment. "You need to actually listen to your father this time," she finally said. "Not just hear him, listen." She was right, and it stung exactly because it was true. For 11 days before that phone call woke me, at 2:17 in the morning, I had let my father sit alone in that house with mustard and old leftovers because I was too proud to be the one who called first. Now I understood with a clarity that made my stomach turn that he had been carrying something far heavier than a bad diet and a stubborn streak. He had been carrying me for 25 years without ever once making me feel the weight of it. A nurse found me a few minutes later. "Dr. Reed, your father is asking for you before they take him back." I found him already prepped, an IV taped into the back of his hand monitor leads, crossing his chest like a strange constellation. He looked smaller under those lights than I remembered him looking even an hour earlier, and that thought bothered me more than anything else that night. My father had always seemed physically indestructible, a man built out of the same tough material as the machines he spent his life repairing. "You opened it," he said before I could speak. Not a question. "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly, and I couldn't tell if it was disappointment or relief. "I told you to wait." "I know." "Then you know why." "I know some of it," I said, and held up my phone so he could see the photograph, the porch light, the maple tree, the dark shape reflected in our front window glass. His face changed the moment he saw it, the color draining from it faster than any monitor alarm could have warned me. He knows you opened it, Dad said quietly. How? My father's jaw tightened, because he's never stopped trying to find out whether I still had the evidence. I pulled the chair close to his bed, my earlier anger folding into something colder and more focused. Dad, I need you to tell me everything. Not the letter version, everything. He looked toward the door, an old habit I recognized now for what it was, the reflex of a man who had spent a quarter century checking to see if anyone was standing where they shouldn't be. There isn't time before surgery. Then make time. He told me in a voice roughened by the oxygen tube beneath his nose about discovering the internal report while servicing diagnostic equipment on contract at a hospital across the city long before I was ever a patient there or a doctor anywhere. About finding evidence that the cardiac device had failed in testing and been released anyway. About Robert Miller, 51 years old, a husband and father dead because a company decided a recall was more expensive than the consequences of admitting what had happened. About taking his concerns up the chain. And about Marcus Vale, then a rising young administrator with the same silver tongue and colder eyes arriving at our house one evening, while I was at school sitting at our kitchen table and making it clear that my father's crusade could jeopardize my medical education and the career I had worked so hard to build. I had the report, Dad said. The original, not a copy. I had documentation. I had a recording. I could have gone to the state board, to a reporter, to a lawyer who actually cared. But every path led back to the same threat. He made sure I understood that. His hand found mine on the blanket cold despite the warmth of the room. So I took a settlement. I signed something I shouldn't have signed, and I used part of that money to start a scholarship fund, so you'd never have to work 3 jobs to pay your way through school the way I almost let you. I sat with that for a long moment, the pieces of 25 years rearranging themselves in my mind. Every unexplained tuition payment, every time Dad deflected a question about money with a shrug and a change of subject, every year he stayed in that same modest house instead of using settlement money to start over somewhere new. He hadn't disappeared with it. He'd spent it protecting a future he was terrified I'd never get to have. Where's the original report now, I asked. The recording, the documents, all of it. Not the copy you gave me tonight, the rest. My father's eyes moved to mine, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, something like his old stubbornness flickered back into them. Somewhere Marcus has spent 25 years trying to find and never has. I made sure of that. Before I could ask where the door opened, and Dr. Patel stepped in with a tablet under her arm. Frank, we're ready to take you back. She glanced between us, reading the tension in the room without needing an explanation for it. 5 minutes. My father gripped my hand harder than I expected from a man with a failing heart. Daniel, whatever you do tonight, don't go looking for it alone. I won't. Promise me. I thought of the promise I'd already broken once that night, and I chose my next words more carefully. I promise I'll be smart about it, Dad. That's the best I can give you. He almost smiled at that, a tired, knowing look that told me he recognized his own stubbornness reflected back at him. That's my son. Then the nurses were moving him, wheeling him toward the operating room doors, and I stood alone in that hallway again, holding a phone with a photograph of my own house on the screen. But I didn't go looking for the evidence alone. Emily refused to let me. And this time I didn't argue. My father's mistake, the one that had cost him 25 years of silence, had been believing that carrying everything himself was the only way to protect me. I wasn't going to repeat it. While Dad was in surgery, I sat with Emily at our kitchen table, the photograph of our own house still glowing on my phone screen between us, and we worked through everything my father had told me, piece by piece, like two people diffusing something that could still go off in their hands. He said Marcus never found it, Emily said. That means your father hid it somewhere deliberate, somewhere that made sense to him. I thought about my father's life, 40 years spent inside factories and garages, a man who trusted machines more easily than people. And then I remembered something he'd mentioned once years ago, in passing, the way people mention things that seem unimportant until they suddenly aren't. A storage unit he kept in Gary, Indiana, just across the state line, where he said he stored old tools he couldn't part with. I had never once asked to see it. I had assumed it held exactly what he said it held. We drove through the night, Emily beside me, instead of a stranger, the two of us saying very little as the city gave way to flat, dark highway. I called the hospital twice along the way. Dad was still in surgery, stable but not out of danger. I tried not to think about the possibility of arriving at that storage unit and finding nothing of my father dying before I ever learned whether any of this had been worth the cost he'd paid. The facility was the kind of place nobody remembers driving past rows of corrugated metal doors under sodium lights that buzz faintly in the cold. I found the unit number written on a slip of paper tucked into my father's wallet, which the hospital had given me, along with his personal effects before surgery. My hands weren't steady on the lock. Inside the unit was exactly what a man like my father would create: careful, unglamorous, and completely deliberate. Metal shelving held old tools exactly as he'd claimed: worn wrenches and a socket set gone slightly rusty with age. But behind a false panel at the back of the bottom shelf, one Emily noticed only because the wood grain didn't quite match the piece beside it, we found a fireproof lockbox. Inside was everything my father's letter had promised. The original internal quality control report, complete with the engineer's handwritten notes, flagging the defect months before the device reached patients. Photographs of internal meeting minutes showing which executives had reviewed and dismissed the findings. And a second audio recording I hadn't known existed, dated a few weeks after the one on the flash drive, this one longer, more damning. Marcus Vale's voice, again younger but unmistakable, no longer simply threatening my father's future, but explicitly instructing him on exactly what language to use in the settlement agreement to limit the hospital system's exposure. There was also something I hadn't expected. A short letter to me tucked beneath the documents, dated only 3 years earlier. Daniel, if you're reading this, then I finally worked up the nerve to tell you, or something happened before I could. Either way, I need you to know I never stopped watching Marcus. I kept records of every promotion he gave you, every award, every donor introduction, not because I thought you didn't earn them. You did, but because a part of me always worried he was keeping you close, so he'd know exactly how much you had to lose if I ever spoke. I'm sorry I let him use you as a leash on me for this long. I should have cut it years ago. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and read it twice. Emily's hand on my shoulder, understanding for the first time the true shape of what my father had endured. It wasn't just a single threat decades ago that he'd carried quietly. It was a slow, ongoing fear that the man who controlled so much of my professional world could still find a way to hurt me if the truth surfaced. My phone buzzed against the concrete floor. Another text. Same unknown number. I heard you left the city tonight. Go home, Daniel. There's nothing in Indiana that your father didn't already destroy. I stared at the lockbox in my lap, at the report, the recordings, the photographs, and I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with fear. Marcus believed the evidence was gone. He'd believed it for 25 years, confident enough to build a career, a reputation, a legacy on top of that belief. He had no idea I was sitting on the one thing that could finally end it. Emily read the message over my shoulder. He's bluffing, she said quietly. He doesn't know what you have. He's just trying to scare you into stopping. She was right. And something about hearing her say it out loud steadied me in a way I badly needed. My father had faced this threat alone 25 years ago, with no wife beside him who understood what was at stake, no adult son who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him against a man with money, lawyers, and hospital connections. I wasn't going to make that same mistake. We're not confronting him tonight, I said, surprising myself with how calm the decision sounded once I said it aloud. Not alone and not without protection first. What do you mean? I looked at the lockbox, then at my phone, already composing a mental list. A lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protection. An investigative reporter I'd once treated as a patient who owed me nothing, but had always said to call if I ever needed her. The hospital's independent compliance office, but only after copies existed somewhere Marcus couldn't reach them. My father had made the mistake of standing alone against a powerful man with nothing but the truth in his hands. I intended to walk in with the truth in triplicate, distributed to enough people that silencing me would accomplish nothing. Before we do anything else, I told Emily, closing the lockbox carefully, we're making sure this evidence exists in 5 different places by morning. Marcus Vale is never getting the chance to make it disappear the way he thinks he already has. We didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up over the Indiana state line, Emily and I had scanned every document in that lockbox at a 24-hour shipping store, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in an echo of the hospital I'd left hours earlier. I emailed encrypted copies to 3 separate addresses: my own personal account, a secure cloud drive Emily controlled, and a friend from residency who now worked as in-house counsel for an unrelated hospital system. Someone with no connection to St. Vincent and no reason for Marcus Vale to ever suspect. Then I called Rachel Ostrowski. Rachel had been my patient 6 years earlier, a 52-year-old investigative journalist who'd survived a heart attack that should have killed her, thanks to a surgery I'd performed at 2 in the morning on a case that had nothing extraordinary about it, except that she happened to live. She'd sent me a card every Christmas since, always signed the same way. If you ever need anything, I mean it. I had never once taken her up on it until that morning. Dr. Reed, she said, picking up on the second ring, despite the early hour, her voice sharpening the moment she heard the tension in mine. What's wrong? I told her everything sitting in my car outside the shipping store with Emily beside me, my father still unconscious in a recovery room I couldn't yet return to. The device. Robert Miller. The settlement. The scholarship built from money that should have gone to a grieving family instead. The 25 years of quiet pressure disguised as mentorship. By the time I finished, Rachel was completely silent for a moment. The kind of silence I recognize from watching families absorb bad news in exam rooms. Send me everything, she finally said, today. And Daniel, don't confront this man before I've had a chance to verify what you have. If even half of this is documented the way you're describing, we're not talking about a quiet resignation. We're talking about potential regulatory violations, possible civil claims, and serious questions about whether the hospital concealed information surrounding a patient death. This needs to go through channels that protect you, not just channels that satisfy you. She was right. And hearing her say it out loud helped me understand something my father had never had the luxury of understanding 25 years earlier. He had been one man with a mechanic's wages and a young family standing against a hospital system's lawyers with nothing but a conscience and a tape recorder. I had resources. He never had a journalist willing to verify and publish a lawyer who understood whistleblower protections and colleagues across an entire hospital network who owed me nothing but professional respect and would take a documented, verified accusation seriously. I spent the next 2 days moving carefully the way my father had taught me without ever meaning to teach me anything about strategy at all, simply by living a life built on quiet, deliberate planning. I met with the whistleblower attorney my residency friend recommended, a sharp, unflappable woman named Diane Kessler, who reviewed the lockbox contents for 6 hours straight before looking up and saying, "This is more than enough to begin formal reporting. We'll notify the state medical board where appropriate, the hospital's independent compliance office and outside counsel. We'll also preserve everything in a way that protects the chain of evidence." I gave a full statement to Rachel, recorded and transcribed, cross-referenced against dates on the internal report and the 2 audio recordings which her outlet's legal team verified as authentic within 48 hours. Robert Miller's family, I learned through Diane's careful outreach, had never received a full explanation for his death. Only a quiet settlement their own lawyer had pushed them to accept 25 years ago told the case was unwinnable against a hospital system's resources. His daughter, now in her 50s herself, cried on the phone with Diane when she heard that someone had finally found proof of what her family had always suspected but could never prove. Only after every piece was in place, copies, secured statements, recorded filings prepared, and the appropriate authorities notified, did I finally agree to see Marcus Vale in person. He requested the meeting himself, calling my office directly 2 days after my father's surgery, his voice carrying the same smooth, unbothered confidence I remembered from 12 years of galas and donor dinners. "Daniel," he said, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a threatening text and a photograph of my house had never been sent from some untraceable number, "I heard about your father. How is he?" "Stable," I said, keeping my voice level, giving away nothing. "I'd like to speak with you. Clear the air. I understand you've been asking some difficult questions." I agreed to meet him. But this time I didn't walk into that room alone. Diane knew exactly where I was going and when. Rachel knew the meeting was taking place. The evidence was already copied and secured outside St. Vincent. The appropriate internal and state channels had already received the material. There would be no dramatic rescue. No one would suddenly appear because I had finally said the right words. If Marcus tried to intimidate me, there would already be a record of what happened. That was the difference between my father's fight and mine. He had carried the truth alone. I didn't have to. Back at the hospital, my father remained in recovery, still weak but stable, his color slowly returning over those 2 days in a way that let me breathe a little easier each time I visited. He didn't know yet what Emily and I had done, what Rachel and Diane had helped assemble in 72 hours that he'd spent 25 years unable to build alone. Sitting beside his bed the night before I was scheduled to meet Marcus, I finally told him. His eyes filled as I described the storage unit, the lockbox, the letter he'd left me 3 years earlier without ever finding the courage to hand it over while he was still strong enough to explain it himself. "You went to Indiana," he said quietly. "I did. I told you not to go alone." "I didn't," I said, and told him about Emily, about Rachel, about Diane, about the copies sitting safely in 3 separate places completely outside Marcus Vale's reach. My father listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he reached for my hand the way he had in the emergency room, Except this time, his grip felt stronger. You did in 3 days what I couldn't do in 25 years, he said. You didn't have what I have, I told him. You didn't have anyone standing beside you. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at our joined hands on the blanket. No, he finally said. I didn't. I made sure of that too in my own way. I thought carrying it alone was the only way to keep you safe from it. His voice softened. I was wrong about a lot of things, Daniel. But I was never wrong about how much I loved you. I stayed with him until he fell asleep, and for the first time since that 2:17 a.m. phone call had woken me, I allowed myself to believe we might actually win this. Marcus chose a conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, the same room where he'd once handed me an award and shaken my hand for the photographers. Sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows onto a long table polished to a mirror shine. He was already seated when I walked in, his silver hair immaculate, his suit perfectly tailored, exactly the picture of quiet authority he'd spent decades cultivating. He gestured to the chair across from him like a man welcoming a colleague, not a man about to be confronted with 25 years of evidence. Sit, Daniel, he said. Whatever's troubling you, I'm sure we can work through it. I sat. I found my father's storage unit, I said without preamble, the original report, the photographs of the meeting minutes, 2 recordings of your voice 25 years apart, both showing exactly how much pressure you put on my father after Robert Miller died. Something flickered across Marcus's face so brief, I might have missed it if I hadn't spent 12 years learning to read him across conference tables exactly like this one. But he recovered quickly. His voice remained smooth. Frank always did have a flair for the dramatic. Recordings can be edited, Daniel. Documents can be misread out of context. I'd be careful about the conclusions you're drawing. They've already been authenticated, I said, by a journalist, by forensic audio analysis, and by a whistleblower attorney who has already initiated formal reporting with the appropriate authorities. Copies exist in 5 separate locations you have no access to. Robert Miller's daughter has already spoken to a lawyer about what her family was never told. I let each sentence land before adding the next one. You threatened my father's ability to protect his own son. You spent 12 years mentoring me, promoting me, introducing me to donors, and the entire time you were making sure my father understood exactly how much I had to lose if he ever told the truth. I leaned forward. That's not mentorship, Marcus. His expression tightened. That's a leash. His hands folded neatly on the table tightened until his knuckles went pale. You have no idea what it took to keep this hospital system solvent through that period, he said, his voice losing its polish for the first time. A recall would have cost hundreds of jobs. Programs that serve thousands of patients every year would have been eliminated. I made a decision that protected far more people than it hurt. Robert Miller doesn't care about your budget, I said. Neither do his daughters. Neither does my father, who spent 25 years carrying your threat instead of his own conscience because you made sure he believed he had no other choice. I leaned forward. And neither do I, Marcus. Not anymore. What do you want, he asked. And for the first time in 12 years, I heard something in his voice I had never once detected before. Fear. Plain and unhidden. A settlement, a quiet resignation I can make either happen. I almost smiled. My father took a settlement 25 years ago because he had one man against a hospital system's lawyers and a son he was terrified of losing. I stood. I have a lawyer, a journalist, the hospital's independent compliance office, and state authorities already holding copies of everything you did. Marcus stared at me. There's no settlement large enough to make this disappear because it isn't just about money anymore. I paused. It's already moving. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus looked at me differently. Not like an employee, not like a younger surgeon whose career he had helped shape. Like a man who had finally realized that the leverage he had spent 25 years building was gone. You think you've won, he asked. No, I looked at him. I think Robert Miller's family deserves the truth. I think my father deserves to stop being afraid. And I think you should finally have to answer for the choices you made. Marcus's face hardened. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing. I turned toward the door. And then something happened that was far more satisfying than a dramatic group of investigators bursting into the room. Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. He answered. Hello? He listened. Who is this? Another pause. His eyes moved toward me. Then he said, I need to call you back. He hung up. I didn't move. What was that? Nothing. I almost laughed. You've spent your entire career making people believe you always know what's coming next. His face tightened. Be careful, Daniel. I opened the door. For the first time in 25 years, Marcus, I am. I walked out. Diane was waiting several floors below, not with a theatrical entourage, but with a folder under one arm and her phone in her hand. She looked at me once. Did he admit anything? Not enough. That's okay. She handed me the phone. He doesn't have to. The hospital's independent compliance office had already opened a formal investigation based on the evidence we had submitted. The state medical board was reviewing the conduct of the licensed medical professionals named in the original report, while the hospital board was separately examining Marcus's administrative actions and whether he had improperly concealed information from patients and families. Rachel's legal team had completed its verification of the recordings and documents. Robert Miller's daughter had agreed to speak publicly. And because the evidence had already been distributed outside St. Vincent, no one person inside the hospital could quietly make it disappear. That was the victory my father had never been given. Not revenge, not a dramatic takedown. Protection. A chance for the truth to survive the people who wanted it buried. The investigation moved faster than I ever could have imagined once it began, propelled by verified recordings of forensic document analysis in Rachel's published story, which broke 2 days later and forced the hospital's board into an emergency session within hours. Marcus Vail was placed on administrative leave immediately. Within the following weeks, the board formally terminated him after reviewing the full scope of the evidence. The state medical board opened formal proceedings involving the licensed clinicians whose conduct was documented in the original records, while investigators separately examined Marcus's role in concealing information, pressuring a witness, and interfering with the truth surrounding Robert Miller's death. No one promised me a neat ending. Diane warned me from the beginning that 25-year-old events could raise complicated legal questions, including statutes of limitation and evidentiary issues. She was right. But the goal was never to manufacture a perfect courtroom ending. It was to establish what happened. And that happened. Robert Miller's family finally received the full documented truth about what had happened to him, along with a legal path toward whatever accountability remained available to them after 25 years. Diane took on their case at no cost. She called it the least she could do. My father's scholarship fund, the one he'd quietly built from settlement money he never should have had to accept, was formally recognized by the hospital as part of the resolution, renamed in a small ceremony months later to honor both Frank Reed and Robert Miller together. That gesture meant more to my father than any apology Marcus Vail never offered him. I sat beside my father's hospital bed that evening and told him everything, watching his face as I described the moment Marcus's composure finally broke, the investigation moving forward and the weight of 25 years beginning to lift. He listened without saying a word until I finished. Then he reached over and gripped my hand. I spent 25 years afraid that if the truth came out, it would destroy everything I built for you, he said quietly. I never once considered that you'd be the one strong enough to make sure it destroyed the lie instead. You gave me everything I needed to do it, I told him. You just never got to see what it looked like when it finally worked. He smiled, then a real smile, tired but unguarded, the kind I hadn't seen on his face in longer than I could remember. Well, he said, I'm seeing it now. My father made a full recovery. It took months of rehabilitation, months of me driving to that same modest house on weekends instead of letting 11 days slip by unnoticed the way I once had. Slowly, the color came back into his face, and the stubbornness came back into his voice, which I'd worried somewhere in the darkest hours of that first night I might never hear again. We talked more in those months than we had in the 3 decades before them combined. The investigation eventually closed. Marcus lost his position in the hospital system and his professional reputation. The remaining legal questions surrounding the old device were resolved through the appropriate civil and regulatory channels, and Robert Miller's family finally received accountability that, even if incomplete after so many years, was real and documented. It wasn't the kind of justice that undoes 25 years of stolen peace. Nothing could do that. But it was enough for Robert Miller's daughters to finally stop wondering whether their father's death had been preventable. And it was enough for my father to finally stop wondering whether telling the truth would destroy his son. As for the scholarship, it now carries both names. The Miller Reed Fund for Medical Ethics. It is awarded each year to a student who has shown courage in reporting wrongdoing they witnessed during their training, a small permanent reminder that the truth is worth protecting even when it costs you something. My father attended the ceremony every year. He always wore the same gray suit, and he always cried quietly during the same part of the speech when the recipient's name was read aloud for the first time. He lived another 11 years after that night in the emergency room. 11 years I nearly lost through my own pride. 11 years I will never stop being grateful for. He came to Claire's graduation. He taught Michael how to rebuild a small engine in our garage one summer, the same patient, wordless teaching method he'd once used on me. And I watched my son absorb it the way I once had without either of them ever needing to call it love out loud. My father died peacefully when he was 89. There was no emergency that final morning. No alarms, no team rushing through the door. Just a quiet room, early light coming through the window, and me sitting beside him the way I had that first terrible night. Except this time, there was nothing left to fear. He opened his eyes. "Daniel, I'm here." He looked at me for a long moment, the same look he used to give an engine he was deciding how to fix. "You became a pretty good doctor," he said. I laughed through the tears already gathering. "Pretty good. Don't get arrogant." His hand found mine on the blanket. "Daniel." "Yeah, Dad. I know I made you carry things you shouldn't have had to carry. The silence, the fear. All those years I let you think I was just difficult when really I was just scared." His eyes filled. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "I know why you did it." I squeezed his hand. "You don't have to apologize for loving me the only way you knew how." He squeezed my hand weaker now than it had been even minutes before. And then he said the words I had waited my entire life to hear, plain and unhurried, exactly the way he said everything that mattered most to him. "I'm proud of you, son." I bent over his hand and cried. Not because he was leaving, because I finally understood how much love had been hidden inside all those years of silence, all those repaired bicycles and cash left wordlessly on the counter, and nights spent checking the furnace outside my door. It had never once been distance. It had always been protection, the only language he knew how to speak fluently. I still keep his old watch on my desk. Some nights during long shifts at the hospital, I touch the worn metal band and think about the man who taught me that saving a life isn't only about the heart beating beneath your hands. Sometimes it's about giving someone the courage to finally speak the truth. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the people you love carry a burden alone the way he once had to. And sometimes, if you're fortunate enough to learn it before it's too late, it's simply about realizing the person you spent your whole life trying to understand was loving you the entire time, in every quiet, unglamorous way he knew how. Michael still keeps a toolbox in our garage. Just in case something needs fixing, he says the way his grandfather always did. Last month, he fixed the porch light Emily always leaves on, without being asked, without telling anyone, the same quiet way his grandfather would have done it. When I asked him why, he just shrugged. "Somebody had to. I had to walk out of the garage so he wouldn't see my face." My father's letter is still in my desk drawer, the paper soft now from how many times I've unfolded it. If you're reading this, then either I lost the argument about surgery, or you finally stopped being stubborn long enough to listen. He was right about more than he knew that night. The truth mattered, but so did his silence. Because I understand now that it was never empty. It was crowded with fear, with sacrifice, and with more love than either of us knew how to say out loud until it was almost too late to say it at all. And if this story reminded you of someone you love, maybe don't wait for tomorrow to reach out. Sometimes we think we have more time than we really do. If you enjoy stories about family forgiveness, hidden truths, and second chances, stay with us for the next story. Because sometimes the truth comes 25 years too late. But as long as there is still time to listen, to forgive, and to say I love you, maybe it isn't too late after all.